The old man walked slowly down the steps of the courthouse that morning, holding his cap in one hand and his small leather bag in the other. The sun was warm, but the early wind was cold against his wrinkled face. His jacket was neatly pressed, even though it was clearly many years old. On the left side of his chest, pinned carefully, was a medal, his medal. It was the one he had earned decades ago while serving his country during the war. He wore it proudly, not to boast, but because it reminded him of the friends he had lost and the strength he had once carried through the hardest days of his life. That day was supposed to be quiet. He had joined a small parade in town, a parade meant to honor those who had served the nation. He had walked slowly with his medal shining in the light. Children waved flags. Some old veterans saluted him. He smiled politely, nodded at people, and walked with dignity. But soon after the parade ended, an officer approached him and said there had been a complaint. Someone had reported him for wearing his medal without permission. He had laughed at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding. But when the officer handed him a piece of paper with a court date, the smile faded from his face. Now on that morning, he walked through the big glass doors of the courthouse. He could feel many eyes watching him. He was a tall man, but his back carried years of weight. His hair was thin and gray, and his steps were careful. Not because he was weak, but because life had taught him to move slowly and think clearly. Inside the courtroom, the air felt cold and tense. People whispered as he passed by. Some recognized him as a war hero. Some just stared at the medal on his chest. He took his seat quietly on the wooden bench in the front row. Across the room, a young woman whispered to her friend, "Why are they bringing him here for that?" An older man shook his head in disbelief. Many people couldn't understand how someone could be taken to court for wearing their own medal. But the paper in his hand was real, and the judge sitting up on the bench was real too. The judge, a white man with sharp glasses and a clean black robe, walked in and sat at the front. He gave a quick look around the room, then focused on the veteran. His eyes didn't carry warmth or kindness. They carried rules, procedure, and a stiff kind of pride. "Next case," the judge said firmly, and the clerk read out the veteran's name. The old man slowly stood. He didn't need anyone to help him. He held his hat at his side and walked to the front of the room. His boots made a soft sound on the floor. There was no lawyer standing next to him. He had chosen to speak for himself. The judge looked down at the papers on his desk and began to read. His voice was formal, distant, as if he were reading a list of rules instead of talking to a human being. "You are being fined," the judge said, "for unauthorized display of a military medal during a public event. This is a violation of section—" The old man didn't move. He didn't blink. He just listened. The words felt cold, but he had faced worse things in life than cold words. Whispers filled the room again. A man in the back shook his head. A woman covered her mouth. A younger man muttered, "This is wrong." But the judge kept reading as if none of it mattered. When the judge finished, he looked up and waited for the veteran to respond. The veteran slowly raised his head. His eyes were calm. His face had the quiet strength of someone who had lived through pain, but had never let it break him. "Your Honor," he said in a steady voice, "I understand what you have read, but this medal isn't a costume. It isn't a decoration for show. It's mine. I earned it." The judge shifted slightly in his chair. "The law is the law," he said. "Whether it is yours or not, you are required to follow protocol. The fine will be imposed." His voice was almost careless. It was as if the medal didn't mean anything at all. The old man didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply nodded. "May I speak for myself?" he asked. The judge seemed a little surprised, but nodded slowly. "You may," he said. The veteran gently opened his old leather bag. Inside were papers neatly stacked. Some were so old their edges were yellow. These were the same papers he had kept safe for years, papers that carried the weight of truth and memory. He carefully took them out one by one and placed them on the table in front of him. People leaned forward. It wasn't common to see an old man stand alone in front of a judge with such quiet confidence. He didn't look scared. He didn't look lost. He looked like a man who knew something others didn't. Before speaking again, he looked at the medal on his chest. He remembered the night he had earned it, how the ground had been cold and the sky full of noise. He remembered his friend who never came back home. That memory gave him strength. The judge cleared his throat impatiently. "Do you have something to say that will change the fact of the violation?" he asked. Yes, the veteran replied simply. His voice was quiet, but it carried far across the room. Some people in the courtroom stopped whispering and just listened. It was as if time had slowed down. The old man straightened his back and placed his hat gently on the table. I have something to say, Your Honor, and I have something to show you. The judge raised his eyebrow. He clearly didn't expect much from this old man. But what he didn't know was that the man standing in front of him was not just a soldier. He was someone who had spent years reading, learning, and helping other veterans understand their rights. The old man rested his hand on the papers and said, "This medal is not just allowed to be worn. It is protected by law. It is a right, not a privilege." His voice didn't shake. It was steady, like a soldier on the battlefield. The judge glanced at the clock, still not taking him too seriously. But the veteran's eyes told a different story. As the bailiff watched quietly, a sense of respect began to spread in the room. People didn't see just an old man anymore. They saw someone who carried history in his chest and strength in his silence. The old man had not yet even opened his documents, but his calmness was enough to make the room feel different. No one laughed. No one doubted him now. Even the judge's hands stopped tapping the desk. He looked around the room briefly, at the faces watching him, at the whispers that had turned to silence, and then he said softly, "This medal isn't something I borrowed. It's something I bled for. So if I am to stand here today, let it be known that I do not stand as a man who broke a rule. I stand as a man who kept a promise to serve and protect even when the world changes around me." The room was silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning above. The judge blinked slowly, not sure how to respond yet. But in that moment, everyone could feel that this case was not going to be simple. The old man reached for the first page of his papers. The real story was just beginning. The fine wasn't going to be the end of it. The truth was about to turn everything around, and though no one said it out loud, many in the courtroom knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, holding his pen loosely between his fingers. The courtroom was still quiet, and all eyes were fixed on the old veteran standing at the front. The air felt thick, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The veteran adjusted his cap, took a deep breath, and slowly unfolded the first paper from the pile. It was an official document, carefully preserved in a plastic sheet. The edges were yellow and slightly curled, but the writing was clear. He had kept it for decades because he knew that one day he might need it, not for himself but to protect the truth. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and clear, "I respect the law, but what you just said isn't the whole law. And if the court allows me, I will show you the part that was left out." The judge raised his brow but said nothing. A few people in the back of the room whispered quietly. An old woman wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She had watched the veteran in the parade earlier that week. She remembered the way children had clapped for him. Now seeing him stand in front of a judge for wearing that same medal felt unreal. The veteran placed the paper carefully on the table. His fingers moved slowly but with purpose. "This document," he continued, "is from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It states clearly that veterans are not only allowed but encouraged to wear their earned medals at public events." The judge tapped his pen on the desk, still showing no emotion. But there was a slight hesitation in his movement now, a sign that the man's words were not so easy to ignore. The veteran went on, "I served this country many years ago. I stood in the dirt with soldiers who never made it home. I carried this medal not because it's shiny, but because it's a piece of their memory too. I have worn it at funerals, at parades, at memorial services. I have never asked anyone's permission to do so. And I have never broken a law." A young man sitting in the gallery leaned forward. He was recording the hearing on his notepad for the local paper. He hadn't expected the story to be this powerful. He had thought it would be a small courtroom case, nothing special. But the way the veteran spoke made everyone feel something. It wasn't just a legal fight. It was about respect. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner," he said, using the veteran's name for the first time, "the law states that unauthorized display can be penalized." The veteran nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. But if you read the entire law, not just one line, you'll see that it also protects veterans who wear their decorations at civic and ceremonial events. It's written right here." He pointed gently at the highlighted section of the document. "Section 772, Title 38, U.S. Code. It's been like this for decades. The judge leaned forward slightly and squinted at the paper. For the first time, his expression changed from firm to unsure. He motioned for the bailiff to bring the document to him. As the paper was handed up, the judge silently read the lines. His forehead wrinkled, not in anger but in realization. The veteran stood silently as the judge read. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He just let the truth speak for itself. A young woman sitting in the second row whispered, "He knows the law better than the judge." An older man next to her nodded. "Of course he does," he said softly. "He lived it." The judge finally set the paper down and took off his glasses for a moment. The quiet in the room grew heavier. The veteran continued, "Your Honor, I didn't come here to disrespect this court, but I will not let the memory of my service or the memory of my brothers who didn't come home be treated like a violation. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm only asking for what's already written in the law." The judge crossed his arms and stared down at the papers. His voice was lower when he finally spoke again. "You seem to know quite a lot about this." The veteran gave a small, humble smile. "Yes, sir. I've spent years helping other veterans who didn't have a voice. I've read these laws many times. I might not wear a lawyer's suit, but I can read and I can understand. And I don't forget." The courtroom began to shift in mood. The tension that had filled the air started to melt into something else. Something like respect. Even the officer who had handed him the ticket earlier sat in the corner looking uneasy. The judge tried to keep his voice steady. "You're telling this court that the fine I gave you is unlawful?" The veteran didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. With all due respect, it is." His words weren't loud, but they were sharp and clear, like a bell ringing through a quiet church. Everyone heard them. Even the judge. The clerk shuffled nervously. The young reporter scribbled furiously on his notepad. The bailiff's serious face softened. And the veteran, standing alone, didn't look small anymore. He looked like a man who had carried the weight of history and still stood tall. The judge looked down again at the law. He flipped through a second book on his desk and compared it. Line after line matched what the veteran had said. There was no trick here, no fancy lawyer's game, just truth. The veteran then gently lifted another paper from his bag. This one was older, its ink fading slightly. "This," he said softly, "is the original letter I received when I was awarded this medal. It carries my name, my service number, and my commanding officer's signature. This is proof that I earned it, and it gives me the right to wear it. Not just in parades. Anywhere." He handed the paper to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The judge read it quietly. The veteran's name was there in bold. The medal listed clearly. The date of service, the war, it was all real. It was undeniable. The judge's hand stilled for a moment as he held the paper. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The veteran continued in a softer tone. "When I put on this jacket this morning, I didn't know I would end up here. I just wanted to honor the friends I lost. They didn't get to walk in parades anymore, but I do, and I walk for them." In that moment, something changed in the air. It wasn't just a legal matter anymore. It was a story about sacrifice, memory, and pride. People in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some feeling guilty for not knowing the law, others feeling inspired by the man's courage. The judge took off his glasses again and rubbed his forehead. He didn't look as sure of himself as he did when the hearing started. "Mr. Turner," he said finally, "how did you know this law so well?" The veteran gave a small laugh, the kind that came from deep inside, shaped by years of patience. "Because I had to, sir. When I came home from the war, things weren't easy. A lot of us didn't have lawyers. We had each other. I learned every line of the veterans' code I could get my hands on. I've spent half my life helping others who were too tired to fight for themselves." The judge didn't respond right away. His pen stopped tapping. His voice softened when he spoke again. "I see." People in the courtroom began to sit up straighter. The young reporter paused his writing, realizing the story unfolding in front of him was bigger than a simple fine. The old man had turned the entire room into a lesson, not just in law but in dignity. The veteran wasn't done. He lifted his chin slightly and said, "This medal isn't a decoration. It's a promise, and no one, not even a court, can take that away from me without breaking the law itself." Those words hung in the air like a banner. Even the judge couldn't ignore them. He leaned back slowly, as if realizing that the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The courtroom didn't cheer. There was no applause. But there was silence, the kind of silence that meant everyone was paying attention. The judge cleared his throat again. His next words came slower. "I'll need to review this carefully." The veteran gave a small nod. He wasn't in a rush. He had waited years for justice before. He could wait a few more minutes now. As the judge reread the documents, the people in the gallery looked at the veteran with new eyes. The man they saw walk in quietly at the beginning wasn't just an old soldier anymore. He was something stronger, a living piece of history who still knew how to stand his ground. The judge finally lowered the papers, but he didn't say anything yet. He just looked at the man standing before him, alone, steady, unshaken, and in that silent moment it became clear to everyone in that courtroom. This was no ordinary case. This was the moment when truth began to turn the tide. The judge sat quietly on his high seat, holding the old papers in his hands. The courtroom felt different now. The tension was no longer about a fine. It was about a truth that had just stepped into the light. The old veteran stood alone in front of the court, not with loud words or anger, but with calm strength. His hands rested on the table, his cap neatly placed beside the papers he had brought. His face showed no fear, only patience and quiet confidence. The judge adjusted his glasses again, slowly rereading the section of the law that the veteran had pointed out. Everyone in the room could feel that the judge was no longer as sure of himself as he was when the hearing began. He tapped the end of his pen on the desk, trying to think of something to say, but words didn't come easily. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner," he said in a lower, slower voice, "it seems you've come here very prepared." The veteran gave a small, respectful nod. "Yes, Your Honor. I learned a long time ago that sometimes to protect what's right you must carry the proof with you. So I kept everything, every paper, every law, every memory." A few people in the back of the courtroom whispered softly. An older woman shook her head with tears in her eyes. She had watched Mr. Turner march in the parade many times over the years. She remembered him waving to the children and giving small salutes to other veterans. She never imagined seeing him standing in front of a judge like this. The judge leaned forward and asked, "You seem to know this law very well. Were you a lawyer?" The veteran smiled faintly, almost shyly. "No, sir. I wasn't a lawyer. I was a soldier. But when I came back home after the war, I spent years reading every law that had to do with veterans. I helped others file their claims. I stood with my brothers when they didn't have anyone to stand with them. And I learned, line by line, word by word." The judge slowly nodded, now realizing this was not a simple case of someone breaking a rule. This was a man who had spent his life understanding the very system that was trying to punish him. The young reporter at the back scribbled on his notepad, his hand moving fast. His eyes were wide. He had come thinking this would be a small, boring court story, but now he knew he was watching something powerful. The veteran opened another folder from his bag. The courtroom watched closely. Inside were letters from other veterans he had helped through the years. Some were simple thank you notes. Some were legal acknowledgments that confirmed his guidance had helped them keep their rights. He held them up and said gently, "I'm not a man who likes to fight in rooms like this. I fought enough when I was young. But I won't stay quiet when someone tries to take away something that belongs not just to me, but to every veteran who ever served." The judge was silent. The bailiff shifted slightly, uncomfortable but deeply moved. Even the officer who had given the veteran the citation lowered his head a little. The words were hitting everyone in the room. The veteran continued, his voice steady but now carrying something stronger. A quiet fire. "Your Honor, I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I didn't come here to make trouble. But when I saw that piece of paper that said I was guilty for wearing this medal," he paused, his fingers lightly touching the medal on his chest, "and I felt something deep inside me. This medal isn't a crime. It's a piece of history. It's proof that I stood where many didn't return from. So if the world has forgotten what this means, then today is the day I remind them." A soft murmur passed through the gallery. The young woman in the second row had tears in her eyes now. She had brought her little boy to see the hearing because she worked at the courthouse. She hadn't expected to be taught a lesson about courage. The judge looked at the papers again and said, "You make a strong argument, Mr. Turner, but laws must be interpreted carefully." The veteran gave a gentle smile. "Yes, Your Honor, and they must also be interpreted completely. Not halfway." The judge looked down again. He knew the veteran was right. The law clearly allowed veterans to wear their earned medals at public ceremonies. The original complaint had been based on a misunderstanding, or maybe even someone's unnecessary bitterness. But the fine that had been issued was already written, and the court had already moved forward with it. The veteran took a deep breath and said something that made the entire room lean closer. "You know, Your Honor, I stood in a trench once. It was cold, wet, and quiet, and I had a young soldier next to me who kept shaking. I told him, when the world doesn't see your worth, you must stand tall anyway. That boy didn't make it home. But I never forgot those words, and I'm standing here today doing what I told him to do." The judge slowly lowered the pen in his hand. He wasn't just listening to legal facts anymore. He was listening to a man's story, a story that carried pain, courage, and truth. The veteran then looked directly at the judge. "I know what some people see when they look at me, an old man in an old jacket. But I also know what this medal means. And I know the law because I had to learn it when no one else would defend us. So yes, I know what I'm talking about." A soft clap came from the back row. Someone quickly shushed the person, but the moment was already there. People weren't seeing a defendant anymore. They were seeing a hero standing alone. The judge gave a small sigh and turned to the clerk. "Read the section again," he said. The clerk nervously flipped through the legal book and began to read the exact words the veteran had cited. Word for word, it matched everything he had said. When the clerk finished, the judge pressed his lips together, clearly realizing the court had made a mistake. The veteran didn't celebrate. He just stood silently, waiting. He wasn't there for applause. He was there for justice. The judge took a long pause, then asked, "Mr. Turner, may I ask why you kept all these documents for so many years?" The veteran looked at the medal again. "Because the world forgets," he said softly. "People move on. They don't remember the faces. They don't remember the laws made to protect those faces. But I do, and as long as I'm breathing, I'll remind them." A young man sitting in the front row wearing a veteran's cap nodded slowly. He understood every word. The judge leaned back again. His face didn't look so stiff anymore. There was a kind of respect forming in his eyes now. "Mr. Turner," he said slowly, "your knowledge of the law is impressive. Honestly, it's better than some lawyers who stand in this room." The veteran smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir. But it's not about being smart. It's about caring enough to learn. That's all." For the first time since the case began, the judge gave a small nod of respect. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. But everyone in the room noticed. Then something unexpected happened. The officer who had issued the fine stood up from the side of the room. His face looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and said quietly, "Your Honor, if I may speak?" The judge looked at him, a bit surprised, but nodded. "Go ahead." The officer turned to face the veteran. His voice was quiet. "Sir, I didn't know about that section of the law. I was just following the report. But after hearing what you said, I know I was wrong. I'm sorry." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. It was rare for an officer to speak like that in a case. The veteran didn't respond right away. He just gave the officer a long, kind look. Then he nodded once, respectfully. "Apology accepted," he said softly. The moment was powerful. It was simple, but it carried weight. The officer sat down again, clearly humbled. The judge finally spoke again. "I believe we have a very important matter here. The court must always be fair, and fairness means recognizing when we have made a mistake." The veteran didn't smile or cheer. He simply stood with quiet dignity, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The judge put the papers down and looked at him with a different expression now. Not as someone being fined, but as someone who had earned respect. "Mr. Turner," the judge said slowly, "you've made your point very clear, and you've done it with honor." The courtroom stayed silent, but everyone could feel the shift. The fine that once felt so certain now felt like it was already falling apart. The veteran's eyes softened as he looked at the medal on his chest. It wasn't about winning. It was about protecting the truth behind it. And as the judge prepared to speak the final decision, everyone in the room leaned forward, waiting. Because now, it wasn't just about one man's medal. It was about something bigger, about respect, memory, and the strength of standing for what is right even when the world tries to forget. The judge sat still for a long time, staring at the papers on the desk in front of him. The courtroom had gone quiet. No one dared to move or whisper. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the old veteran standing at the front. He wasn't a loud man. He wasn't waving his arms or shouting to make a point. He stood tall, calm, and steady, the metal on his chest catching the soft light from the tall windows behind him. The officer who had apologized now kept his head lowered, hands folded in his lap. The young reporter had stopped scribbling for a moment because what he was seeing was no longer just news. It was history happening in front of him. The judge slowly placed his glasses down on the table. His face was no longer tight and serious the way it had been at the beginning of the hearing. He looked thoughtful, maybe even a little heavy-hearted. He lifted his head and spoke clearly, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "Mr. Turner," the judge said softly, "you've given this court a lesson today that none of us will forget soon." The old veteran didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod, his eyes calm but sharp. He had stood his ground with dignity. The judge looked around the courtroom almost as if he wanted everyone else to hear the weight of his next words. "This man," he said, pointing gently toward the veteran, "did not come in here with a lawyer. He didn't come in here with a big firm behind him. He came with truth, knowledge, and honor, and that is something I must respect." The sound of the pen tapping on the desk had stopped completely. Even the bailiff, who usually looked serious and stiff, was now watching the veteran with quiet respect. The judge picked up the legal book once more and flipped to the same section of law that the veteran had shown earlier. His finger moved slowly down the page. "The law is clear," he said finally. "The fine that was issued against Mr. Turner was not only wrong, it was unlawful." A soft murmur ran through the gallery. A woman put her hand over her heart. A man sitting in the back row whispered, "I knew it." The judge lifted his gaze again. "Therefore," he said firmly, "this court withdraws the fine against Mr. Turner immediately." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, almost too big to absorb. And then a small sound, barely a breath at first, escaped from the back row. A man sighed deeply, a sound of relief. Another woman nodded with tears in her eyes. But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned forward and spoke even more clearly now, with a different tone in his voice. "And further," he continued, "this court acknowledges that Mr. Turner was exercising his legal and honorable right to wear his medal at a public event. This medal is not a costume. It is a piece of our nation's history." The old veteran blinked slowly. He had expected the fine to be removed, but he hadn't expected those extra words. The judge wasn't just clearing his name. He was giving him back his dignity in front of everyone. The judge then looked toward the officer who had given the ticket. "Officer," he said, "I appreciate your honesty earlier, but I also hope this moment reminds us all that we must know the law fully before we act on it." The officer nodded firmly, his face serious. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. The judge returned his gaze to the veteran. "Mr. Turner, I owe you something that this court rarely gives." He paused. "An apology. I may not have issued the original fine, but as the one who represents the law here, I must say to you, this should never have happened." A hush fell over the room. It was rare to hear a judge say such words. The veteran stood silently, but something warm flickered in his eyes. He gave a slow nod, not proud, not triumphant, just deeply respectful. "I accept your apology, Your Honor," the veteran said in his steady, quiet voice, "and I thank you for seeing the truth." The judge exhaled slowly, as if a weight had lifted from the room. He straightened his robe and added, "You should know something, Mr. Turner. I've been a judge for many years. I've seen angry people, clever people, and people trying to fool the court, but I've never seen someone walk in with this kind of quiet strength. You didn't raise your voice once, and yet you made the whole room listen." The young reporter felt a chill run down his arms as he wrote those words down quickly. This was not just a small-town story anymore. It was a story about courage and truth. A small smile touched the veteran's lips. "Your Honor," he said gently, "sometimes if the truth is strong enough, you don't need to shout." The judge nodded slowly, almost as if he was the one being taught now. "That," he said, "is something more of us need to learn." The veteran began to gather his papers carefully, folding each one with respect and sliding it back into his worn leather bag. The same bag he had carried since his service days. His movements were slow but sure, like a man who had walked this kind of road before, not in courtrooms but in life. But before he could step away from the table, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Turner," he said, "if you don't mind, I'd like you to share a few words with this courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a veteran." The request surprised many in the gallery. Judges rarely asked someone to speak like that. The old man paused for a moment, then gave a small nod. He placed his hat gently on the table, straightened his shoulders, and turned slightly to face the rows of people sitting behind him. "When I was young," he began softly, "I didn't wear this medal for myself. I wore it for the brothers who stood beside me in the cold, in the rain, and in places where no one wanted to go. We didn't fight for glory. We fought for each other. And when I came home, I promised myself I would carry their memory with me for as long as I lived." Every word came out slow and heavy, not because he was tired, but because each word carried weight, real weight. "I kept every letter, every law, every memory because I knew one day the world might forget. But I didn't." His hand gently brushed the medal on his chest. "This medal isn't just mine. It belongs to them too." The gallery was silent. Even the judge was sitting a little straighter now, as if listening not as a judge but as a man. The veteran continued, "When someone tried to fine me for wearing this, I wasn't angry. I was sad. Sad because it showed how easy it is to forget what these little pieces of metal mean. But today something good happened. We didn't fight with anger. We stood with truth. And truth stood tall." There was a faint tremor in his voice at the end, not from fear but from deep emotion. One by one, people in the gallery stood up. At first, it was a quiet gesture. An older man in the back row who was also wearing a small veteran's pin. Then a young woman stood. Then the officer. Soon the entire room was standing silently. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The respect was louder than any cheer could have been. The judge stood as well, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. "Mr. Turner," he said with respect in his voice, "on behalf of this court and this town, thank you for your service. And thank you for reminding us what honor looks like." The veteran gave a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." The bailiff gently opened the courtroom door. The veteran picked up his cap and his bag. As he walked out, people moved aside to let him pass. The young reporter wiped his eyes quickly, pretending it was just dust. As he reached the hallway, a few people approached him quietly. A woman held her little boy's hand and whispered, "Thank you, sir." An older man shook his hand firmly. A teenager wearing a school backpack gave a shy salute. The veteran didn't make a big speech outside. He didn't wave or smile widely. He simply nodded to each person, grateful but humble. Inside the courtroom, the judge was still standing. The officer sat with his head lowered, reflecting on what had just happened. And the reporter knew that this story would travel far beyond those four walls. The man who walked in accused of a crime had walked out a hero in the eyes of everyone who had seen him stand. Not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through quiet truth. And as Mr. Turner stepped into the sunlight, the wind gently touched the metal on his chest. It shined softly, not loudly, just like the man who wore it. The old veteran walked slowly out of the courthouse that afternoon, the autumn sun shining softly over the town square. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant traffic. The metal on his chest gleamed gently, not in a showy way, but with a quiet dignity, like a small light that didn't need to shout to be seen. People had followed him out of the courtroom, not as curious onlookers anymore, but as witnesses to something meaningful. The young reporter who had spent the whole hearing scribbling in his notebook stood on the steps, unsure whether to ask for an interview or just stand there in silence. A few older folks were wiping their eyes. Some younger ones looked at him with new respect, the kind usually reserved for people who carry stories too heavy for most to understand. Mr. Turner didn't look proud or boastful. He wasn't the kind of man to enjoy attention. His steps were steady, measured, and calm. He placed his hat on his head, pulled his jacket a little tighter against the cool air, and walked down the courthouse steps as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. A woman carrying a small child approached him first. She was the same woman who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, listening to every word he said. She stopped in front of him, and her little boy, who couldn't have been older than 6, raised his hand in a small salute. The boy's salute wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. The veteran paused, bent down slowly to the boy's level, and smiled warmly. "Thank you, young man," he said gently. "You've got a strong salute there." The boy grinned shyly, and the mother whispered, "Thank you, sir, for everything." He nodded, tipping his hat slightly before standing back up. More people began to step forward. A young man wearing a hoodie shook his hand firmly and said, "You showed them. You showed all of us." The veteran smiled softly. "I didn't show anyone anything." "The truth did." Another man, older and wearing a veteran's cap, stepped up. His voice was rough with emotion. "I served too," he said quietly, "but I never had the courage to speak up like that." "Thank you." The veteran reached out, shook his hand, and said, "It's never about shouting, brother. It's about standing." More hands reached for him. Not for selfies, not for fame, but for something simple and real. Respect. A few local officers stood to the side. One of them was the same officer who had given him the ticket. He slowly approached, his face serious but humble. "Mr. Turner," the officer said, standing in front of him. "I was wrong. I didn't understand the full law, and I didn't understand what that medal really meant. I'll never make that mistake again." The veteran studied his face for a moment. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness. He simply placed his hand on the officer's shoulder and said, "Then it was worth it." The officer nodded, his jaw tight with emotion, and quietly stepped back. The young reporter finally gathered the courage to speak. "Mr. Turner," he said nervously, "I'm writing about this for the paper. People will read your story. They'll know what happened here today. Is there anything you'd like to say to them?" The veteran looked at him with kind eyes, then slowly glanced down at the medal on his chest. He thought for a moment before answering. "Tell them this," he said softly. "This medal isn't a decoration. It's a promise. A promise made a long time ago. Some of us came home. Some of us didn't. I wear this not because I need people to look at me, but because I promised I would remember, and I did." The reporter's pen trembled slightly as he wrote those words. He had covered many stories before, accidents, speeches, small-town events, but he had never written something like this. The veteran turned to look at the courthouse building behind him. A few hours ago, it had been just a place where he had been told he was wrong. Now it had become the place where the truth stood up taller than any accusation. The crowd slowly began to thin out. People gave him their quiet goodbyes, nodding their heads with respect. Some simply placed their hands over their hearts. A few older veterans saluted him as he walked past. Mr. Turner made his way down the quiet sidewalk. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every step he took felt light, like a burden he had carried for many years had finally been set down. He had never wanted a fight, but when the fight came, he stood strong. He passed by a small coffee shop on the corner where a group of young men were talking. One of them pointed at him and whispered to his friend. But this time it wasn't mocking or dismissive. It was full of respect. They had seen him inside the courtroom, standing alone but unshaken. The veteran walked a few more blocks to the park. It was the same park where the parade had taken place just a few days earlier. The benches were almost empty except for a few older folks enjoying the afternoon. He sat down on a wooden bench under a tree whose leaves were turning golden brown. For a moment everything was quiet. The breeze touched the metal gently, making it shine under the sunlight. He took off his hat and placed it on his lap. His hands rested on top of it, still steady, though a little tired. He let his eyes drift toward the memorial in the center of the park, a stone wall with names carved into it. Names of the men he had served with. Names of boys who had never made it home. He had looked at those names many times over the years, but today it felt different. "Thank you, boys," he whispered softly to the stone. "We did it right today." He sat quietly for a while, letting the world slow down around him. A young girl with her father passed by. She looked at the medal and asked in a curious voice, "Daddy, what's that shiny thing on the old man?" The father knelt beside her and whispered something softly. The little girl's eyes grew wide with wonder. She turned to the veteran and waved shyly. He waved back, smiling warmly. The father said, "Thank you for your service, sir." Mr. Turner replied gently, "Thank you for remembering." The sun was slowly starting to set, casting a golden light across the park. The trees swayed softly in the wind, as if bowing to a quiet song only they could hear. Later that evening, the story appeared in the local paper and began to spread online. The young reporter had written it with care, keeping every detail of what had happened in that courtroom. He described the way the veteran had stood, how he had spoken calmly, and how the judge himself had apologized. People far away, who had never met Mr. Turner, read the story and felt something deep in their hearts. Veterans in other towns shared it with their families. Young people who had never seen war read it and learned something they had never been taught in school. Not about fighting, but about standing for truth. Mr. Turner didn't care much about newspapers or online posts. He wasn't chasing fame. But in the quiet of his home that night, as he placed his jacket on the chair by the door, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He walked to a small wooden box on a shelf in his living room. Inside it were old letters, photos, and the original certificate that came with the medal. He gently placed the papers from the courtroom inside the box, closing it softly. Then he sat down in his old chair by the window. The night was calm. Crickets sang in the distance. A warm yellow lamp lit the room. He leaned back, letting out a slow, quiet breath. He didn't think of the judge or the fine anymore. He thought of his brothers who didn't make it home, the ones whose names were carved on that stone wall. And he whispered, "We're still standing." The next morning, people in town would talk about the man who walked into a courtroom alone and walked out having reminded everyone what honor means. Some would say he was brave. Others would say he was brilliant. But those who were there that day knew the truth. He was simply a man who refused to let the world forget. And long after the whispers faded, the story of that day would live on, not because of loud speeches or grand gestures, but because of one man, one medal, and one unshakable truth. Mr. Turner stood for something that never needed to be shouted to be heard. He stood for respect. He stood for memory. And most of all, he stood for what was right. As the night deepened outside, the old medal on the chair caught the light one last time. It shined softly like a quiet promise kept.